My name is Paula Fenn, and I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. I work with adult individuals. I'm also a regression therapist and trained at the Past Life Regression Academy. So I'm here today to give you a talk about trauma and various ways that we could transform trauma. So some of the information I share with you today might consolidate knowledge that you've already got, but there's a benefit in that integration. But hopefully there's some ideas here, things that you've not thought about that you could go explore and integrate into practice. So I'm going to begin by making reference to this image, and it's by Edvard Munch, and it's called The Scream. And I start the presentation there because I think it's very relevant to trauma, in that how Edvard Munch describes it is very relevant. It's like a scream emanating through nature. And I'd link that with the scream emanating through the person, through the system. So I think when we start to enter the world of trauma, the first thing that comes to mind are traumatic events. So I share with you there a range of traumatic events, and make mention here that it's not only the being right in the midst of the traumatic event, but it's also bearing witness to, observing trauma happen to others. So just a couple of examples. So being involved in a natural disaster, an earthquake, being involved in a terrorist attack, and of course the being in it but also the bearing witness to it is really important. Other examples like serious accidents, car crashes, being violated, being abused, all very traumatic events. So I think it gets a little bit more complicated when we layer into all those traumatic events, past life traumatic events, because not only are you in a tsunami or violated by a rape, but you might have actually died in a traumatic event. So I think it gets ever more complex in terms of some of the techniques that I'm going to share with you. And as we get into trauma and thinking about symptoms, it's also making reference to the kind of symptoms that might occur in a current life, but also those symptoms that are from the present life, because I think it can be somewhat different that you were hung or beheaded or violated until you died. I just think it's important to kind of bring that into view. So trauma in itself is not defined by the traumatic event. Trauma is actually defined by the effects on an individual, but of course effects are in combination with event. So that's important. Trauma is an effect, not an event. So let's start to talk about some of the symptoms of trauma. Now, trauma is what we call a psychophysiological experience. And what that means is that it involves mind, body, and emotions. So as examples, in the experience of trauma, there can be very heightened emotions. So intense anger, intense rage, intense fear, sadness, and so on. And at a physical level, the somatic body, there's all kinds of effects going on there, which are linked with the autonomic nervous system as well. So some examples include faster respiration, quicker pulse, palpitations, sweating or chills, and of course hypersensitivity and hypervigilance to external stimuli. And that is two of the dominant areas that present in post-traumatic stress disorder. That heightened alertness in the autonomic nervous system and in the emotions. In trauma, the mind becomes overwhelmed, and essentially the mind has to do various things because of the state of overwhelm. Some aspects of the trauma will go into explicit memory, and in explicit memory, it's like everyday memory. We can recall it and retrieve it, but a lot of the effects of trauma will be implicit, so will not be readily available to the mind. And that's because in trauma, the mind goes into a state of overwhelm because of the hyper arousal in the whole system. So further symptoms of trauma include the fight, flight, or freeze response. And again, that's an automatically generated survival mechanism. If a person in a microsecond almost determines that flight is possible, you know, if I run, I'll actually get away and not be attacked or killed. Or if they feel that they can fight back, they absolutely will recruit in that force of adrenaline to fight, to save themselves. But often those are not possible, and what will happen is freeze will occur. And freeze is very significant in terms of considering the work of regression therapy, because freeze can bring about thoughts and emotional reactions of not being good enough, not being brave enough, carrying shame and guilt that they didn't save themselves. Why did I not fight him off, for example? And why did I not jump in to save that other person that I seen was in a traumatic situation? Clearly, there's a lot of overwhelm in the system, and that's when dissociation can occur. Now, dissociation is one of the key elements in trauma.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Before you go on. With the freeze,
yeah.
Is that also connected to sort of like when a rabbit's been attacked by a cat, it just freezes? Is this
yes,
a similar?
It can be, and
because it doesn't want to be attacked, so
yeah,
it tends to be dead, sort of.
Yes, and it's an absolutely instinctive survival response. It's not due to repression, because in repression there's a sense that something has been thought and considered. Just like the rabbit doesn't think, I'll play dead, it just does it. Yeah, so
it works.
Absolutely, but invariably in human situations it doesn't often work.
Increasing, never quite made sense to me before.
Yeah. So dissociation, this is a really important part of the presentation. So Dissociation is what we call a splitting defense. It's a very heightened survival mechanism. And it occurs when the trauma or aspects of the trauma are deemed to be so overwhelming that the person goes into effectively an altered state of consciousness. And often there's no choice. It just arrives. And that's why it's important to know that in terms of working with shame with clients, for example, because you could give that psychoeducation that is a very normal reaction and you didn't really have a choice. You know, it's a way of working with that. Yeah. And so they dissociate because of the inability to cope, either at an emotional level, a level of cognitive awareness, or a physical level. They go somewhere else, and it's got an analgesic effect often on the body when the body's implicated, because essentially there's a major deadening of awareness on the multiple levels of experience. And sometimes, and this links with what you said, sometimes there's these dissociative extremes that we call tonic immobility, where it is a literal freezing and stiffening of the body. And we often see that in abuse victims, for example. What to say about this is just a little case example, and I will be running little case examples through this just to kind of amplify what I'm talking about. I had a client once that was in that catatonic state, and he was literally carried into my consulting room in a hospital. A nurse and his wife actually carried this man in because he was in rigor. And what happened about, the work was good and there was a cure, but what was going on there, he was made redundant. And being made redundant was so traumatic, he could not face it, that it actually had that major effect on him. And I raise that to say that trauma is very unique, or the experience of trauma is very unique. Some people will shut down at cognitive levels, some people emotional, some people physical, or some people will remember it all and others nothing, you see? So it's like grief. You know, grief is very personal. Trauma is also very, very personal.
Paula, can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah, of course.
The freeze and the deadening,
Yeah.
and that sort of analgesic, when loads of people describe, oh, I saw myself at that moment, whether they're splitting up with someone or they're having a car crash, I don't mean actual near-death experiences,
Yes.
but they jump out. From a psychologist's point of view, is that their energy is jumping out, or is there something going on with the chemicals in the brain that they're seeing it from a distance?
I'm not sure about a chemical explanation, but yeah, they've left their body behind, and yes, often there's those out-of-body experiences. You know, I seen myself lift the car off the child, you know, and there's that splitting mechanism. It is dissociative, but it's dissociative in a different way. Yeah, but it is relevant.
I just wondered if you also class that as a survival instinct, almost like it's something that the body does for survival while they're in that state, to almost get a different perspective before coming back in.
Yes. What I would say is there's the intention towards out-of-body experience. You know, we choose to have them in a spiritual sense. But there's also the dissociative out-of-body experience. So I would very much put that in the realm of dissociation.
So just a quick question. So when you know you get solid fragmentation, so when something traumatic happens, a part of you stays at the time and place.
Yes.
And what you said, Janet, with you seeing the experience, does that part of you come back?
Not always.
So that's maybe a part of that soul fragment then stays.
Yes.
It will come out and you go back.
Yes. Parts of the self, whenever there's that splitting, what is the splitting? You know, where did you go? Where did you not go? And it's about retrieving fragments, of course. Yeah.
So you would look for that, if that someone's talking about that experience, you would maybe look a bit deeper to see if there has been a fragmentation there. That'd be a good
Yes, yes. But because any work of healing or caregiving is about bringing wholeness to the system. So if that involves fragments, yeah, of course, we want them back. And I do go into that later, yeah.
You also have a unique background in Western psychiatry and regression therapy. The splitting off, is that something that is actually accepted now within traditional psychiatric?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the splitting defense runs through a lot of psychological theory. Yeah, but not the energetic aspect of it, which I go into as well. Yeah, but splitting, I mean, it's often commonly spoke about in the transference dynamics, because that which is split off in the client can be empathized with by the therapist and worked on. But that's a whole other kind of Jungian unconscious to unconscious communication discussion. And it's like, I've only got an hour. More classes or whatever. Right, so dissociative memory, and I call it memory because it's actually not remembered. So everyday events, everyday effects, we put them into memory banks at explicit levels. So, you know, even sitting here today, right now, we could remember it, and our mind and our brains will organize that experience, and it's able to be recalled at will. You know, I remember that Saturday, blah, blah, blah. We process it, and then we store it like in a filing cabinet. In dissociation, this is the big problem. It's not stored in the same way. And it's not stored because it's not being processed, because it's being split off out of somatic, cognitive, or emotional awareness. So some parts will be explicit. You know, you might remember the event at a mental level, but you sure don't remember it at a physical level. So that's really important. And because they're not stored, because they've not been processed in the same way, these dissociated memories effectively become trapped in the system, and they free float around the system. Now, the problem with that is obviously that state of chaos in the system. And also because they're not filed away nicely and neatly, they're always available, ready to be reactivated, ready to be re-triggered at any time. And yeah, they're trapped and they're completely stuck, and there's no way of gaining access to them other than actually doing the work to try to get to the root of the problem. So Babette Rothschild, who's one of the key thinkers in trauma from a psychological point of view, that is, says that the most severe consequences of trauma result from dissociation. And that's because the traumas are encoded in the system, but free floating around the system on all these different levels and ready to be recalled by what I call trauma-inducing activators. And that's what's called state-dependent recall, which are the triggers that reactivate these chaotic traumas that are just running havoc through the system.
What do you think about displacement? Like someone was in an earthquake and all of a sudden, since that was in a high place, she becomes afraid of being in a car going to a high place.
Right.
And every time that situation comes up, the whole trauma comes back up.
Yes.
Is it similar or what's
It is
about
really similar. That would be called a trauma-inducing activator. And I'm going to give some, enrich that by giving little case examples, because that's important. Okay. So let's talk about somatic memories. And of course, they're not memories in the way we think about memory. So at a physical level, so a woman ordinarily has a good sex life with her partner, it's consensual sex, and then one night her arm becomes trapped behind her back during this nice sex. That became a trauma-inducing activator, like the heights, because she was previously raped, and during the rape, of course, at the somatic level, the arm was trapped behind the back. So that activated a whole range of chaos in the system, because of course you can't often make those links, and that's why you need therapeutic assistance to help you to make the links. So another woman goes for a gynecological exam with a doctor, and essentially she found it very disturbing. She had heightened anxiety about it, which was disproportionate to the actual event of having that test. And then her system's completely hyperactivated, but she's not necessarily, again, making the links, but there's been that trauma-inducing activator to overwhelm the system. And with her, it turns out that she was raped, was it in a past life? She was raped in a past life, and it just kind of generated that memory. That's not quite a memory until you work with it. Physiological memories, we don't often hear much about this, but this is things like a male client I was seeing decided he needed a lifestyle change. He was putting weight on, decided I'll get a gym membership, go to the gym, work out. And what happened with him is that accelerated heart rate that was being achieved by being on the treadmill became a trauma-inducing activator, which actually was linked with a past life experience where when he was knifed in the back, he had that physiological memory, so to speak, trapped in the system. Does that make sense? In another case, a lady always used to get a big pain in her back when she was under stress and anxiety, and Wissam helped me with this case actually. She used to always have a pain in her back under stress and anxiety, and what ended up coming into awareness through therapeutic work about that is actually the stress. So the hyper alertness in the system just due to everyday stressors was bringing up this pain, which was linked to, in a current life, when she was being raped, she was lying on a hairbrush. You see? So I think this might be helpful in terms of thinking about your work, where people come in and they say, I just don't know what's going on, but I'm in a bad place, and you maybe can't find the cause because it's in this realm of these trauma-inducing activators. So, more examples, visual memories, auditory memories, and olfactory, which is smell. Again, they could activate original chaotic traumas that are not stored in memory because they've been dissociated. So flashbacks is a sort of very well-known one where people can have these flashes of visual memory, but there's no story to link with it, and so it's really disturbing. And that's why I use that Edvard Munch painting, because it is like a scream. There's a scream, but you don't know why there's a scream. The full memory can't be recalled, and I've put here that it's like the example you have when maybe clients present because they've had bleed through. So maybe they've gone to a different country, and all of a sudden the visual imagery of that particular country starts to activate some sort of memory somewhere. But it's not a trauma memory, but it's just a little other way of describing it to you. Auditory memories, very, very common in post-traumatic stress disorder, where very small sounds in the environment that aren't even similar to the original sound experienced in the trauma can completely activate and re-traumatize the system. A little case example here is in a past life, someone died on a battleship, and there was a big explosion on the battleship, and they died in the water as a result of that. And he presented with heightened ringing in his ears. Olfactory, so yes, smell. Smell is a sensate experience, so it works with our physiology. One example here is I worked with a lady who was a train driver. She presented to me with post-traumatic stress disorder, and what the event was she was working up in the mines in Kalgoorlie in Western Australia. I practiced in Perth at the time, so that's why Kalgoorlie. She was trapped in this tunnel for hours in this massive train, and they couldn't get to her to get her out of the tunnel. And I had some perfume on that day, and it was a good lesson for me about sensate and olfactory and not to wear perfume in practice. So a little kind of note to self, guys. And it was my perfume became the trauma-inducing activator, because in the Kalgoorlie lifestyle, it's the male-dominated mining society. There's lots of bars and clubs and women of the night and perfume. And there was that link there between the smell of perfume and her being trapped in the train.
It wasn't even the same perfume, it's just a perfume.
It's, just that, I guess, that pungent aroma.
And the smell wasn't even the train when she was trapped, it was outside when she wasn't socializing.
Yes, yes. Right, and I think because in that male-dominated society, it was all like, oh, you got trapped in a train for 6 hours in the dark in a tunnel. What's the big deal? You know, and she was a woman, and being pretty brave to be up there in that mining community doing that work. So.
You've got brave to go to Kalgoorlie anyway.
Yeah, you do, actually. Okay, so let's talk about energy. And the first thing I want to say is, or maybe ask a rhetorical question, isn't it so irritating that the thinkers, the theorists, the psychologists, the neurobiologists, etc., make no mention of energy? It is so frustrating. We've all got to change that. So some of these key thinkers on these images, Van der Kolk, Rothschild, they're good at what they do, but they miss the energy. So I'm trying to rectify that in whatever time I've got left. And in my work, of course. So what's frustrating about that is that we are energy bodies, and science can prove that we are energy bodies. So it's not non-scientific to talk about trauma and how it interconnects with our energy system. As far as I know, up to now, they've got EMF readers that could dictate up to 15 feet away from the body, but it might be improved.
That's the harder math. They've proven that.
Okay, yeah, but of
It
course,
can be wider than that.
yeah,
It's because the machine can't.
the machine cannot scientifically prove it, but our
No,
field,
it can prove up to about, I think it's about 10 feet, so about 2.5 meters or something.
right, yeah,
But actually, they think it's probably much larger than they think.
absolutely,
But they
because
can't record it.
our fields are unbounded.
Yes.
Our fields never end, and that's where, for another day, another time perhaps, we're thinking about the fusion of trauma, a traumatized world, and how we're all affected by individual traumas because of being in a field of trauma. So, let's focus on some of the energetic effects of trauma. When we experience trauma, effectively, our systems blow a fuse. There's disconnect in the system, things like the meridians and so on, just disconnect from each other and then need help, like wonderful acupuncturists, to reconnect those lines of exchange in the system. We short circuit effectively, so that needs to be healed. Also, the trauma comes into the energy body and it becomes very toxic because it stagnates. It creates a blockage in the energy system, and that is because the links between trauma and dissociation. If you don't know it, let's say at a physical level, because you shut down, if you don't know it, you can't process it. And if you can't process it at an energetic level, it's just an energetically dead part of the system. Little example, female clients that are struggling to have children. And you do the work, and in past lives they've had problems with children being taken away, children dying, or dying during childbirth and all, because like a couple of the images there, it's like a stagnant area in the energy system. So that protective survival mechanism of dissociation makes things very complicated at the energetic level, because although it's a survival mechanism, to wall off and protect the self from the awareness of the event, the trauma never ends because it's trapped in the system just waiting to be readily reactivated by these state-dependent recalls and trauma-inducing activators, which could be as simple as running on a treadmill. So, let's get into ways that we could transform trauma. So one of the first ways I thought to share with you is the removal of objects. Very, very important. And what I'll say about that is that the body struggles, the energy body specifically, struggles to work in linear time. The energy body operates in non-linear time, like the work of regression therapy. So the energy of objects related to traumas that are trapped in the system, they're also lodged in the energy field. And to bring about wholeness and healing and transformation, they need to be removed. Now, I'm sure most people here have removed various objects in your work from clients, and it is absolutely crucial, because like that lady who every time she felt anxious she had that sharp pain in her back, that was from a hairbrush. If that object is not removed at an energetic level, it will always be there. So just a few little examples from clients, in my work with clients. Removal of a knife from a person's back. Removal of a noose from around someone's neck. And a really interesting one, the cutting away of bandages in a person that was mummified in a past life. But when she was mummified, she was still alive. Now, the trauma-inducing activator for that female client was feeling constrained by a very controlling husband that was making her feel trapped and stagnant and suffocated. So she comes in presenting with relationship issues. But when you do the work, it was this mummification. So of course it was necessary to cut away the bandages from that lady. So, in the very fabulous Peter Mac book, Inner Healing Journeys, A Medical Perspective, please, everybody get that book. It is Inner Healing Journeys by Peter Mac. So, Dr. Oliveira, who writes one of the chapters in the book, says, the body is where the physical violence of the individual's past and the associated emotions are most vividly experienced and recorded. And that is very true. And he provides in his chapter a case history of a client who suffered from severe asthma, a narrowing of the passage of the larynx, and a flattened trachea. Now, this lady was supposed to have quite life-threatening surgery to deal with this flattened trachea because she could not breathe and was really debilitated. But Dr. Oliveira done the past life regression work and discovered in 3 separate lives she had died from asphyxiation. So it was all associated with the current organic symptoms. So in one life she died by effectively being hog-tied, ropes all around her body. Another life hanging and in another life suffocated by smoke. So what he did to transform the trauma was remove the ropes from around the body, remove the noose from around the neck, and in the suffocation by smoke death, meet a child that she lost as a result of dying in the smoke. And this lady was healed at a physical level. And what's great about these SMART team doctors is that they've got the benefit of the scans, the x-rays, all the scientific technology to just go in and prove this. And her body was completely healed. But it took that removal of these objects, as well as some other transformation techniques like Gestalt techniques as well were used to help. And the activating trigger for this lady was the death of her father. There's always a trauma-inducing activator present. And maybe that's something that you could take with you. Where's the activator? Because this person doesn't know how, why, what's going on, but they're here. So let's discover it. So something that we're trained to do at the Past Life Regression Academy is very, very important in that world of transforming trauma. And it's using bridges. Now, I've made various comments on 3 different pages, and I'm hoping that this is a useful reference deck for you, to take with you. So, for example, what we're looking at bridging from is the body, the emotions, and the mind. I'm not going to go through every word that I've written in the comments, but essentially in the comments page on physical body, it's ways to do it and why it's so important, and essentially because the body remembers, but the memory is a different kind of memory. So what we do to transform trauma using bridges and thinking of it energetically as well is that clients will normally present with a kind of dominant presenting realm of experience. So someone might present with physical symptoms like the lady in Dr. Oliveira's case. Others might present with a kind of script or some kind of narrative, so at a cognitive level, and other people might present with heightened emotions. And of course, what we need to do is work with that presentation, work with that energy that's present and use it to bridge towards that which is dissociated. So for example, if the client is presenting, as in this slide, where the realm of experience that is heightened is at a somatic level, we use that, we deepen that to bridge towards emotion and bridge toward mind. And what we're doing there is we're bringing about a transformation because we're bringing about the ability to process. And that is the transformation of trauma. Accessing, discovering, and then processing in order to transmute. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So again, working with heightened emotions that are present, deepening emotions to bridge towards the body and bridge towards cognition. And catharsis, obviously, is an important way to release trapped trauma. But when we think about the mind and cognition, mental thoughts, it's really important to link the emotional content with the mind. Catharsis is all well and good in terms of releasing energy, but in order to fully process it, you need to make all these links. So if the mind could then understand why there's this heightened state of emotion, then the traumatic memory can be processed. All good?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Flying through. Now, something that I very dominantly work in is the field of relational trauma. And I thought this would be good to just share a little bit of that with you now. When I talk about relational trauma, what I'm talking about is often long-term trauma inside a relationship. So, for example, the adult that presents to you, but who is a child that's been neglected all of their lives. The incest child, the child that's been abused again and again. The wife that's been in domestic violence situation for 20 years. Instead of the one-time hit trauma, which is devastating enough, this has a more penetrative effect on the system because this is occurring inside relationship with other people. It's multi-layered, and just make a brief mention here that I've got a lot of respect for a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst and couples therapist called Brett Carr. And Brett Carr at the moment is fighting the system in the world of schizophrenia to say that schizophrenia is a relational trauma. That these are traumatized children that become the people in the schizophrenic wards in psychiatric establishments. Exactly, yeah. And he's trying to kind of put out to the community this new realm of attachment theory, all about infanticidal attachment, and I'm really curious about it, where the child is born but the child was not wanted, so there was a death wish for that child. So really there's relational trauma all through that child's childhood because the mum tried to abort that baby, or the mum wanted to abort that baby, so that person knows they were never supposed to be here. And that is a massive trauma which will come into your consulting rooms in the adult.
What's his name, Brett?
Brett Carr, K-A-H-R. So effects of relational trauma include shame, disappointment, low self-worth, low self-esteem, not feeling good enough, feeling worthless, but also having lots of trapped anger. Because in relational trauma, the survival mechanism also kicks in, where there's a lot of collusion with the aggressor. If your mum's an alcoholic and there's no food in the house, you're going to try to love mum as much as you can, because if you could then be a love object for your mum, maybe she'll care enough to feed you. This is the world of deprivation and neglect, you know. So the child doesn't shout and scream. There's like a freeze response in that trauma. The child doesn't say, where's my food? Or why have you left me in my diaper for 2 nights? You know, this is our world. It is a traumatized world where these things happen day in, day out. That child can't fight back, can't say stop, can't say no, don't do that to me, because they can't let themselves know they don't love. Because if they let themselves know that they can't love that mum, who's going to save them? You see? So it's very traumatizing. There's no other option but to collude with the aggressor. And that's what we also get in rape situations and incest situations. Hostages, identification with the aggressor is actually the clinical term for it. Because in order to survive, maybe if I'm their friend, or maybe if they like me, or maybe if I do what they say, then I'll be saved from whatever it might be. So I bring this up because thinking about stuck and trapped emotions and where does that rage go? Well, I'll tell you where it goes. It's turned back on the self. It adds to that sense of worthlessness and not good enoughness, and then it's trapped in the system. So, moving on. So the victim could often carry emotions that I say do not belong to them. The emotions have been catalyzed by this relational trauma, but they couldn't actually let the emotion flow towards the person, but the emotion still occurred, so the emotion does full circle and comes back on the self. So we've got to get rid of that, and that's got to be returned to the person. So unexpressed rage and anger, for example, towards perpetrators. Also, parts of the client's energy can be left behind with the perpetrator. Parts of the perpetrator's energy trapped with the client. And you get what I'll call, and I'm going to speed up, auric field fusion. And with auric field fusion, there needs to be an uncoupling of energy fields. And essentially, there's a range of techniques I shared with you there, but I'm just going to quickly go through them. So there's pushing the perpetrator energetically out of the field. That's one way to uncouple, so that there's no intersect. There's my bubble and your bubble. There's energy callbacks to retrieve lost and trapped energy with the perpetrator. And there's also energy paybacks. And these are all transforming trauma techniques, okay? So with an energy payback, that's returning the energy that you're carrying that doesn't belong to you, that belongs to a perpetrator, for example, that you're returning to them. It's trapped in your field, it's having a traumatizing effect on you, so it needs to be given back. It's not psychic attack. In fact, it's a general rule to cleanse the energy that is being returned. And sometimes the perpetrators will not want to take the energy back, and that's why I've got these little pictures, examples of little symbolic ways clients have determined for themselves to return and pay back energy. Put them in nice boxes, caskets, and say, okay, open it when you're ready, to the perpetrator. It's your energy, it's not mine. And this is almost the last slide. And just briefly skimming through additional techniques is, of course, using Gestalt methods, recruiting in empty chair techniques, perpetrators in chairs, different parts of self in chairs, different timelines, different past lives in chairs. Interplane communication, which is really, really important for mental processing. Because if you could step into the field of your perpetrator and deeply empathize with their position, why they did what they did to you, why did my mum not love me enough to ever feed me, for example, then you could get a walking in their shoes understanding of why they did, and it really helps at a cognitive level to process the trauma and create a narrative that helps dissolve the traumatic effects. And of course, inner child work includes all of the above. Bridges, visual imagery, use of symbols, Gestalt methods, uncoupling energy fields, energy payback, soul retrieval, etc. And before I finish, I can't ignore all the spiritual helpers. Because in this complex, deep energy work, we need as much help as we can get, right? So recruiting in our clients, spiritual guides and helpers, and our own, and just a couple of examples there that we are trained in the academy. But Greg McHugh writes about them in his book, and about using meshes of light to put meshes through to retrieve lost energy, and mesh through yourself to return that energy to perpetrators, for example. What I've not been able to share in depth today, there's more in the slide deck. And there's a good reference list for you to follow up on this field. Okay, is there room for any questions or comments?
Right.
I did find that last bit really interesting because I've never checked about any residue energy that's left from the perpetrator before. So that's
Right.
one I'll take with me.
Yeah. Now, when you've got someone that's really full of shame and guilt, look for the split. Sorry, I want to say this. If, let's say you've been raped, is your rapist full of shame and guilt and self-doubt for what he's done? No. It's been split off. The shamelessness in the perpetrator is the shame that can be energetically carried by the client. So always look and try to find ways to do the energy payback.
And it can always be done in trance. They don't have to, if they were raped by their father, they don't have to give a box to their father. But is that sometimes more effective?
It's really effective because you can work really symbolically by what's the object. And then you're actually, because it's all about containment and lack of containment. Your rapist or your abusive, nasty, neglectful father was not contained enough to care properly. So that's why symbolically containers are really good, because then the client's got something to pour into.
Yeah.
So it's all well and good pouring towards the person, but it seems more powerful that there's actually a container. The client can say it's full now. You can't say it's full now if it's just, projecting. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be altered state work. I use this in everyday consciousness psychotherapeutic work. It doesn't seem to need operating from a different level of consciousness.
Do you ever find they don't want to give the container to the perpetrator because they've received enough understanding and healing to think it's okay now?
What is very common is they're too full of shame. to return. It is shameful for them to give that bad energy back to someone else. And that is the point, isn't it? That they're so full of shame, and their brain's been wired all those decades, perhaps, to be ashamed.
I'm thinking more on the other side is that they've seen it all from a very high level. They've
Yeah.
got a spiritual awareness.
Right.
And they don't want to give that back.
Right.
Because they have their understanding, they know it was a lesson they chose, etc., etc. They
Right.
don't want to give that, what they perceive as negative energy,
Sure.
to somebody.
But then I would encourage them to know it's not negative energy. It's a part of someone else. And so, like, the good side of it, that perpetrator, for example, should be in their own fullness, and it's a gift. And that's why sometimes people make beautiful gift boxes with ribbons and balloons tied on, and it's like, here, Dad, for example, here's this beautiful gift for you, and it's up to you when you open it, because it's part of the energy of them, you see.
It could be profoundly deep learning for them to gain from that energy.
Yeah.
Well, that's really
Okay.